Hey, somebody needs to limber up the thesaurus. You have? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to the Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. Hey, thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here today, and with every show we do, is to play the part of a best friend or a coach. I want to help you live the life of your wildest dreams by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. The Professional Noticer is sponsored this week by our friends at Hunker ATV, where the sheer variety of power sport products will blow your mind. Hustler turf equipment, the entire line of Echo power tools, and of course, every make and model of Polaris ATVs. The big Polaris side-by-sides and even bigger Ranger crew. And you have to see the showroom. The taxidermy, the antique displays, and indoor porch with a porch swing, its own porch swing, and comfortable chairs and television and free coffee, all inside. Stop in and meet Shannon and Lisa Tucker. They treat customers like family, which is why folks from 14 states have done business with Tucker ATV. Highway 43 North in Jackson, Alabama. Tucker ATV, the small town business with the national reputation. Observations and answers, that's what we do here on the Professional Noticer. And we love it when somebody comes to the table with both. You know, I have made it part of my life's work the past number of years to make sure that the people that I run across know the name Michael Perry. I mean, I will bring this guy's name up in conversations. It just because. I mean, he calls himself an accidental New York Times bestselling author, which I kind of think anybody who is a New York Times bestselling author, it relates to that, because I don't know who aspires to that. But he's a humorist and a playwright. I found him quite by accident in the middle of a tornado years ago, and have been fascinated by this guy's writing and what he produces. He lives in New Auburn, Wisconsin, and he also produces a popular audio newsletter, Michael Perry's Voicemail. Please welcome Michael Perry. Mike, how are you?
Hey, I'm glad to be here. I'm in the big city because out in the country where I live, our internet is powered by a very weak-willed hamster.
I was talking yesterday with a guy that I would love to put you guys in the same room. In fact, when I got off the recording with Sean, the people in my office said, "Man, if we could get Sean Dietrich and Michael Perry in the same room at the same time to talk." But Sean Dietrich is a guy that he comments on the American South, and people call him Sean of the South, and he writes short blog posts every day, and he's written 13 or 14 books, really good. He's a great writer, but he comes from an odd background like you, and he is one of my favorite writers like you. There's a handful of people, you, Sean, Robert Rourke, which he's dead, so I guess he doesn't care. But I really force you guys on people because I'm such a little teenage girl fan of you and your writing. So what's your latest book? What's happening?
Well, you always make me nervous because things we've talked before that I'm deep enough into this writing career. I always feel like I have to say career because it's never planned into it, but I'm deep enough into this that not everything I write is beloved by my readership anymore. And of late, I've gone off in some different directions that not everyone has gone with me on. Although I find that when I come back, they're still waiting. So that's good news. Right now, I have a collection of short pieces. I write a column called Roughneck Grace, and every once in a while we take those and gather them up and release them in book form. And I just turned in the final edits of that, so hopefully it'll be out in the next month or 2 months. And that book is called Hunker, Essays on Human Connection. And I didn't set out to write a collection of essays about human connection. It's just a bunch of newspaper columns, really. But as I was going through them and reading them one after the other, and then I also was recording the audiobook at the same time, I just noticed that, yeah, just about every other piece had there was some moment where I was reaching out, if not swinging down to shoot the breeze of my neighbor Denny at the mailbox, or sometimes reaching out, trying to understand someone maybe who didn't see the world the way I did. And so that subtitle, Essays on Human Connection, I liked the idea of that because hunker is, I like that word. I think hunker,
I think hunker's a great word. I think that we should call the pandemic the great hunkering.
Yeah, because to hunker is, and I don't have it in front of me, so I can't quote it, but I wrote something that a lot of times people think of hunker as something dark, and in a sense it is. I mean, you got to hunker down. You might have to endure some things, but I think we can all benefit from enduring some things. But it's also a way of taking care of those around you and preparing for when things do open up again, you're ready. So that collection, and then you and I have talked before, but I have a novella, which is it's real short, and it's very dark. It's about a farmer losing his farm. And that's the one I'm nervous about because there's no real happy ending. And there's even some paths that might be upsetting to some people. But you know what I have done? I've showed that book to a number of people in farming and a number of people in mental health and agriculture, and to a person, they've said, no, publish it just the way it is. It needs to be that way. So those are the two main things I'm working on. And then I have.
So that's not out yet, right?
No, and that's
because I keep going on your site. I go on sneezingcow.com and waiting for, because you've mentioned that before, and I'm waiting for that announcement. And because you make these odd observations about, I'm writing something that people are not going to like, and I'm like, what could Michael Perry write that people don't like? And so naturally it's just like pro bull riding or NASCAR. I want to see a wreck, so I'm wanting to see what is it that you're writing that you think people aren't going to like, because I'm going to like it.
I have to give you credit, though, because you've actually given me encouragement in this regard, because I think at the end of the day, I'm not writing anything to be provocative. There's plenty of provocation in the world.
Right.
I do write out of some sense of curiosity, or trying again to make that human connection, to explore an idea. And to explore something isn't necessarily to validate it or promote it. It's to try to understand it. And you told me a while back, you said, no, there are a lot of us right now, I think, that are just hungry for discussion and exploration, and not any big declaration. That's another one. It's like, man, there's plenty of declaration going on right now.
Right.
So yeah, and then I'm working on 2 other books under contract with the 2 I just mentioned. I'm just going to self-publish. That works best for me for some of my books. And then I have 2 other books I'm finishing up that are under contract with publishers. And then I'm on the road with the band, and I'm on the road speaking, and I write a newspaper column, and I write a radio show every week. And there's plenty to do. Plus,
you sound like me. And sometimes I sleep. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I had a phone call with my wife earlier today so we could both figure out where we were and if we would see each other by the end of the day. So.
Right. Yeah. My wife stopped by here a little while ago, and I was like, hey, it's you. It's the, I'm not used to seeing you this time of day, but oh my gosh. I thought of you the other day. I was in Nashville, and I was with Jeff Allen, which, if you don't know Jeff Allen, you need to YouTube Jeff Allen. Jeff Allen is who I think is like he is the best technical comedian that's working today. And he has been working for years. And you can see him on YouTube. He has millions of views on certain things. But Jeff Allen, and I was at his house, and Jeff and his wife live just outside Nashville, and they have chickens, and so I naturally thought of you and your book Coop, and I was telling Jeff about you and telling, man, you got to read Michael Perry, but Jeff, Jeff is from Chicago. He's not from
Not from
he's not
around
from
these parts.
he's from like a city,
Yeah.
and so to Jeff, chickens are it. I'll give you an example. He said that he had a chicken that sat on some eggs, and they had babies. That's what he said. They had babies, and 7 of these babies were roosters. And he said so they're crowing and they're screaming their heads off, and then they're fighting. And he said so I had to like kill some of the roosters. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, I just so I had to go out and throw them in the woods. And I said, you didn't eat them? And he said, never occurred to me. I mean, never occurred to you? Have you got chickens? You're eating the eggs. You got chickens. You eat chicken. You buy chicken from the store. It never occurred to you. But that's how much of a city boy Jeff is. But you'll hear Jeff says, like, never occurred to me.
That's a great line.
You just threw them in the woods.
What do you think those Colonel Sanders have been making that stuff out of?
I know. I said, what are you buying? What are you buying? Good grief! I'm excited about reading something that you have waded into, that you've kind of made yourself explore. Because I consider you, when I read your work, you're one of the greatest writers that you write exploratory sentences. I think that if you read old time, you read 150 years ago, what they were writing, sentences were paragraphs, and they would just run on and on and on and on. And so, obviously our teachers in high school would tell us, yeah, no, you can't do that. That's a run-on sentence. And so somewhere that became out of the norm. But then there are some people who can pull it off and make a long, long sentence make sense. And it's a delight. And that is what you do. I sometimes I'll be reading your stuff, and I'll go into Polly and I'll say, just listen to this. Just listen to this sentence. Just listen to this one sentence. The one about the drunk cat, the cat drinking in a bar. That one just kills me. I wish I had it right here where I could read it, but I forget what book that's in, but that one just kills me.
That was in either Million Billion or in Peaceful Persistence. Yeah, I remember that because I walked out. The cat was puking, and you're desperate when you write a column every week. You're desperate for a column, and I just remember walking out to feed the chickens or let them out that day, and the cat was under the apple tree, I think, puking, and I just remember thinking, oh well, that should be a column. Not funny,
yeah.
But I think then I went on a flight of fancy. Like, imagine that he was hungover and he'd been out to the kiddie bar the night before. But I'm really smiling when you mention this because this other book, this Hunker book that we're talking about, I just 2 days ago sat beside the editor making the final changes to the final draft. And she's a terrific editor. I don't have an academic background in writing or in grammar. I write by ear, and that's great because you can create some lovely organic sentences, as you mentioned. But at some point, you also do need to help from someone who knows the rules. And when I agree with you, the rules that we were taught in high school, they apply most of the time, but they're also made to be broken. But she's great because she really understands that balance. Like, she'll tell me, well, properly, this is what this sentence should be, but I do know what you're trying to do, and then we'll talk about it. And she just is always, she circles so many commas in my writing, and then we talk about whether or not that comma needs to stay there. So that's part of the reason I was smiling. The other reason I'm smiling is you've said a lot of very kind things about me over time, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm not above some pretty petty behavior, and sometimes in print. And what the story I was telling this editor as we were working on all these commas is, you never know when you write something what is going to motivate someone to send you a cranky letter. And I wrote a piece of, actually, coincidentally enough, I wrote a little column about what it was like to go on tour with my band. We're not famous. I mean, we're professional. We get paid. We bring back more money than we leave with. That's the point.
Right.
But we're not famous, and we're all jumping into basically one van. And so I was just talking about what that life is like, and how even for us, a 3 or 4 day run, that there's a rhythm to it. And it's get in the van, drive to the hotel, put your stuff in the hotel, drive to the venue, load out, sound check, get ready, then play, then load out and put the merch back in. There's this rhythm. And so the very last paragraph of that column, I wrote something run on with commas, very intentionally replicating the feel of the day that just builds and builds and builds, and it doesn't stop until boom, all of a sudden you're in the hotel room. I got a letter that week from some woman who read it and said that last sentence, and she had counted the words in the sentence. And she had said it had X amount of words, and it had all these run-on sentence. It's a run-on sentence and way too many commas. And she made some snide comment about whether or not I was qualified to be a writer. So without saying anything, the very next column, the very next week, I made sure that the opening paragraph was 7 words longer than the close. Well, I'm not always pure of heart, Andy.
I think I think that's just awesome.
You didn't like that one? Check out this one.
Yeah, check out this one. It is amazing to me. I always think about that that episode of The Partridge Family when we were growing up, when David Cassidy was, the Partridge Family, and he was in high school, and he said that a teacher was on him, that it was after him, and they said, no, she didn't. And he says, I'm telling you, she's got it in for me. And so he turned in an essay that Ernest Hemingway had written, and he got a C on it. And so he said, there you go. There you are. And I think about that because there are so many opportunities now that I look at. When I first started writing, and an editor started messing with my stuff, they would say, you can't start a sentence with but. You can't start a sentence with and. You can't. You putting too many exclamation marks, and now they say, well, that's my style, and so they like.
I think it's like everything in this life. We're going to just keep coming back to this. It's a balance. I get people expecting me, they'll say, what about the adversarial relationship with your editor? And I go, well, most of the editors I've ever worked with are smarter than I am, and they make me look smarter than I am. And even if I'm being a little self-deprecating, it's absolutely true when it comes to the rules of grammar. And I don't mind that person as long as we can have a conversation. And then you also, as a writer, you won't improve if you don't listen to other people. I do have, I've run into people when they're starting to write, and I say, well, who do you read? And they go, well, I don't read anyone else because I don't want it to influence my style. Well, then that's like musicians saying, I'll never listen to any other music because I don't, of course, where do you think style comes from, and where do you think you decide that there are things you want to emulate and things you want to avoid? So, yeah, I mean, I can take it to a bigger discussion. I just spoke to a whole bunch of high school students in a rural town near where I live, and one of the things I like to do when I talk to in those small rural towns where I'm from is I talk about writing a book about old pickup trucks. And I talk about, I wrote a book about French philosophy that one of the chapters starts with me going to the Augusta Bean and Bacon Days demolition derby with my daughters. And obviously I'm trying to convey the idea that you don't have to just be a good old boy. You can actually be a good old boy and read a book. And one of the things I've noticed recently is I can do about a half hour, and I do sometimes on stage, of pretty hilarious stories about working with editors and publicists who are in New York City in a high rise somewhere.
Right.
And lately I've been working with some people out of LA, and I can tell some pretty funny stories on them. But I'll notice occasionally the laughter, if I'm in a rural area, will start to get a little bit too pleased with itself. And then I'll flip it and say, but these are also very hardworking, talented people who have found the way to the top of their profession. And they have a lot to teach me. And the people at New York publishing companies have also opened up a huge world for this farm kid. And so it's always that whole balance of sticking, like I'm definitely at the point now, sitting down with that editor to talk about those commas, even if it's considered an extraneous comma. But I'm also not so precious about my work that I'm not even going to entertain her suggestion. And the fact is, we probably did about 50-50. I cut 50% of the commas and left 50% of them in. To me, in this case, that's about rhythm. The comma it's a little beat. It's a way that you're delivering the sentence.
Right. Because I think that's about what I get too when I'm working with editors, because I'm writing what I'm hearing in my head. I'm writing as I'm like a talking, and so I'm putting the commas where I pause. And
the other thing is knowing your audience, knowing your style. The one time that people always want me to come up with examples of when I actually had to really fight for something, and I haven't really had that many set tos, but there was one time, it was in the book Population 485. And this is a regional thing, but I wrote in there that the general store was kitty corner from the bar. And the New York copy editor just kept changing kitty corner to catter corner. And I kept changing it back. And finally they called me and they said, I said, well, where I'm from, it's kitty corner. And she said, but if you put kitty corner, nobody's going to know what you're talking about. And that's when my hackles get up a little bit. I go, no, nobody where you're from will know what I'm talking about. But where I'm from, if I put catter corner, we don't say that. And so
right.
There's an example of, again, I was angry about it, but I was just going, no, where I'm from, that's the proper word. And that's what we're going with. And
do you ever find yourself, see, I get into disagreements with editors, not necessarily about style, but I get into disagreements with them about content, about historical stuff.
That's a tough. Oh, go ahead.
Well, it's just like, they'll say, well, when I look on the internet, it says this, and it doesn't say that. And it seems like every book I write, I have to re-educate whoever I'm working with about how history is recorded. It's like, look, 1,000 years ago, something happened, and a bunch of people talked about it, and 500 years ago, somebody wrote it, and then somebody else across town said, that's not what my granddaddy said, and then they wrote a different thing, and then by the time 200 years ago, there's 5 versions of it, and now there's 20 versions of it. And so when you go and research it, you have to pick either what you think is correct or what is going to go with what you're writing.
You have to be, so the example that I've always given, and if I've already told you this story, you can cut me off, but I have a story I tell. One of my most popular live humor performance stories is about my next door neighbor getting kicked by a dead cow.
Yeah.
And I have told that story going on, at least 15 years. The story itself, I think I wrote it. I think I have a collection called From the Top, and I think it's in there. But I've told that story live forever. It's about the neighbor I grew up farming with, he was he helped my dad learn how to farm. And there's this whole wonderful shaggy dog, very much, you know what it if I may, I don't ever claim to be this guy, but you're probably one of the few people I do interviews with who will know this name. You remember Jerry Clower?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So,
Oh.
yeah. I mean, in style and delivery, of course, it's nothing like Jerry Clower, but it's just one of those stories where I didn't have to make it up. All you got to do is just report the details in order, and it turns into a hilarious adventure. And it basically winds up with this guy getting kicked by a dead cow. And I told that story for 15 years, and it's gotten so popular. But I made the mistake of telling it in front of my brother. And when I got done, he said, well, that's not exactly how it happened. And then he lists 4 or 5 very specific things that I got wrong about the story. What I find interesting is there's no question about the arc of the story, and that, yes, got kicked by a dead cow. He's not in any way casting doubt on the event, but these very specific details. And what I really find interesting about that, especially in this day and age of where we're all trying to sort through information and decide what's accurate and what isn't, and what's the motivation behind the person sharing the information. I'm not running for office or nothing. I have no vested interest in telling you anything other than the actual story.
Right.
Just these little details that over the years, both of us, two men who love and respect each other, nonetheless remember specific details differently. And so at the end of the day, I come back to what you say. The story is true. We both agree it happened. And I guess when he tells it, the guy will get kicked in the ankle. When I tell it, he's going to get kicked in the kneecap. It's like you have to at some point decide what you're going to go with. And again, it's not about deceiving anyone. It's just about the permutations of memory.
Yeah. Do you find that when you speak sometimes, like I used to work as a comedian, and I don't know why people think comedian would be good for children, but but sometimes people would try to say, "Hey, talk to the kids," and I'm like, I can't talk to the kids, because they're culturally if they haven't experienced it, it's not funny. I remember the first time I toured Canada, and I was in the middle of an Abraham Lincoln bit, and right in the middle of it, I thought, oh my God, he wasn't their president. They didn't know who this is, And because if you don't know who it is, it's not funny. And so I find sometimes that when they have the publisher will get the first copy edit done, and I can tell it's done by an intern. Mm-hmm. It's gone through because I'll get these questions like, and this, I'm not making this up. I wrote in a book I did called Bottom of the Pool, and I was explaining about imagination, and I was saying, that I'm ready to go on this journey with you, and I'm willing to be Lewis to your Clark, but I don't want to head us off into the lemming wilderness without, And so I made the remark, and then it comes back. I get this comment from one of the copy editors on the site that says, I cannot find lemming wilderness on a map. Can you please advise? And I'm like, really? They didn't get the reference about lemmings, and but those just like, it's like, oh my gosh.
I think it really depends. I have run into that with some magazine editing. By and large, in the books I've done with HarperCollins, where they hire professional copy editors, those folks blow my mind because they find things. I was just telling this story the other day. In one of my books, Visiting Tom, I write about how the interstate came right through his farm. And I wrote about the turnip holes and how they were these big earth-moving machines and they were coming through. And the reason I wrote about that is because it evoked a memory of when they put the first blacktop road through our farm back home. We had these huge machines that fascinated us. And I described them and how they worked. And I got this note from this New York City copy editor starting to explain to me that I had gotten that equipment wrong. And there's another case where right off the bat, I was like, whoa, you're not gonna tell me about how heavy equipment. And I started reading it, and then I started looking up, and he was absolutely right. He had found a distinction that I had completely overlooked. He did the same thing with, I said, of a morning, Tom, when he was a little boy, would go down to the creek and down there in the lowlands in the fog. And this guy said, well, if you look it up, actually lowlands, that's a mountain reference. What you're actually talking about are bottomlands. And again, I was like, oh, you're splitting it. And then I look it up and go, oh, he's right. So that stuff I love. I learned something. I don't mind that. A word that I use to this day, I have 2 daughters. And in my first book with my current editor at Harper, I wrote about my older daughter, or oldest, my oldest daughter. And she just said, that's not your oldest daughter. You have 2 daughters, right? And I said, yes. She goes, that's your elder daughter. You have an elder and a younger, but you don't have an oldest. And again, a distinction that I don't mind that stuff if I'm learning something. But if someone is never heard of a lemming, yeah, that's a problem.
I know. It's like, what do you do? But
That's the kind of person that doesn't know enough to eat a rooster.
who do you read? You know, sometimes you read some stuff that makes you just want to go right. I mean, you read it and think, man, I just want to write now. But then there's sometimes you read some people's stuff and you go, I don't even know how
I bother.
Yeah, I don't even know how you do that. Why do I even? What are examples of both on those ends of those spectrums for you?
Well, I think the easy one for me, the go-to, and has been since the day I read an interview with him and then got one of his books back in the 90s, was Jim Harrison, author who wrote, well, most people know him because he wrote the novella Legends of the Fall, which became a very famous movie with Brad Pitt. But he wrote a ton of other stuff. And I got interested in him because Jim Harrison was from Michigan. And I read an interview with him once back again in the 90s, where he talked about living in rural Michigan and hunting and eating meat and being very much a rural Midwestern guy. And yet he also wrote beautifully about poetry, and he wrote about drinking wine in the south of France. And I had, I think, been looking for someone who could understand pickup trucks and hunting, but could also not be afraid to explore finer things or more delicate things. And so Jim Harrison, there's something about, and later in life, he just died here a few years ago. Later in life, a few of his books became a little tough for me because he hit certain themes to the point where I frankly wasn't comfortable with it. But when I go back, when I'm stuck and hung up and have forgotten why I do this, I go pull out Legends of the Fall or Dalva or just any of the first 20 years of his stuff. And there's just something about he didn't write complicated books. They just kind of flowed, but there was just something about the way he put words together and the way that he just assumed that there's something about the way he writes that he assumes you're along for the ride. And I love that idea too. You experience that because you're writing with the audience in mind, and the audience doesn't always have a face, but you're just always trying to think, am I writing in such a way that people want to be on this ride? And is there momentum? Is there a reason for them to stick around? And Jim Harrison definitely is that guy. He comes close to making me not want to write again, but I think because of his blue collar Michigan nature, he's more of an encouragement than a discouragement. The other person very recently that I was rereading again was Dylan Thomas, the poet. And he inspires me because of the way that he throws words together. But he's also one where when you read one of his poems, you go, yeah, that's why I quit writing poems. So I think there's just that uh, he was almost psychedelic in the way that he wrote. And I'm not a guy, I've never taken any, I've never even had a beer. But occasionally reading someone like Dylan Thomas is the closest I come to dropping acid. It's like I've got
Yeah, yeah.
breathe up my head just reading his stuff. Yeah. And then as far as the other stuff, I think just about any given issue of the Atlantic or the New Yorker or something like that, if you read a really good piece in there, yeah, I mean, I'll start, you have to be the same as me at this point in what we do. It's like, we know how to do this. We're playing ball, right? We're on the team. But then there's always that guy that's just the superstar that you just read and go, yeah, I'll be over here on the bench. Let me know if you need me in the third quarter. Got a
I
couple.
know. I know.
Or the
Rick,
seventh inning. I can wrap out a nice solid single.
yeah, Rick Bragg is that way to
Oh,
me.
see, yeah, of course.
I read Rick Bragg, and Rick is so. I've never met him, but we have some mutual friends, and I am just totally. I'm speechless about his stuff. I read All Over But the Shoutin', which is a small
Yeah.
book, but oh my gosh, I how you put words together that evoke such feeling and such hidden anger and hurt and love and where you go, I know exactly what he's talking about, but I could have never expressed that.
Yeah. And so much of that, I think, is about how a writer sees the world and then finds a way to put that on the page. And that, like, again, you and I have talked enough that I always say I'm not real deep into the woo-woo part. I think, I come to it with that blue collar background. You got to sit down, you got to crank out the words, you got to do the job, you got to collect the check if you've got kids. But when I'm going back to read Harrison or going back to read Dylan Thomas, or when you go to read Rick Bragg, I went back and read a bunch of poetry recently because I just needed to. And what really broke me loose was I just this novella that I keep talking about, threatening to release. As much as it makes me nervous, it's the purest bit of writing I've done in years. And that's what I think both of us, we may be pretty down to earth fellers, but there is a part of this process that comes from I don't know where. And
Right.
I've never lost the hunger for that. I occasionally need to remind myself that's why I started doing this. And the beauty of that too is even so I write a newspaper column every week, and even in that, there's going to be at least a line or two that come from the woo-woo place. And you've been cultivating that. It's like any craft. If the person who makes fine furniture knows a whole bunch of really fundamental stuff about wood, but the people that make the really amazing furniture also know they touch a piece of wood or they look at it from a certain angle and they see something we don't, and that's their woo-woo part. That's where they turn that wood into something that you couldn't do even if you had all the tools and all the directions. So
Right. That's when you go back and you read something that you've written and you can kind of barely remember writing that.
yes.
And you can acknowledge, wow, that's really good. It's some of what used to bother me because after I wrote The Traveler's Gift, that one hit, and I was like a rookie pitcher who had won 20 games and was unsigned. And so I got signed to a 3-book deal, and which I was happy with. But then I sat down to write the next one, and I was terrified because I thought, I don't know how I did the first one.
That's right.
And it took me a while to get over that. Are you familiar with a guy named Stephen Ranella?
Sounds familiar, but I don't.
You would like this guy. He has a. I've never met him, uh, but he has a show on. I think Netflix does this show, but it's called Meat Eater, and
Oh,
and and he is like Jim Harrison in that he hunts and fishes, but boy, he can write. I mean,
yeah.
my wife will watch these, and my boys found this,
Mhm.
and he has several books. One is American Bison that is just brilliant, and but he he writes about it in a way that my wife, who's not really interested in hunting, she'll listen to it and go, "Man, he's deep. He's really smart." And I just I he's a guy that I would love to have a conversation with at some point. But check him out, Stephen Ranella.
Now that you
And
described the show, yeah, I have. I've read about it, so I'll follow up on it. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
yeah,
And you know what you just described is a lesson that I learned a long time ago, but have to keep learning, which is trust the reader. So you said your wife wouldn't necessarily be interested in this topic, but the writing, you start to read it and you want to go on that ride. And I have to remind myself of that so much. It's not a matter of me convincing the reader they need to read this. Just go ahead and write it, and the reader will decide. And in most cases, they'll come along with you if they feel that you're speaking from the heart and honestly. You mentioned something else too that you talked about knowing that you could do it, right? And knowing, we're going back and reading a line and going, yeah, that was good. And that's always been interesting for me because I come from, you and I have discussed, my background was about charity and humility, and my father taught us that and modeled that. And humility leads to self-deprecation, and self-deprecation I think is important, and I try to be self-deprecating, but I've had some learned elders in my life get on my case occasionally and say, you can overdo that to the point where you're actually insulting your audience because you're going, oh, you shouldn't be reading, I don't know what I'm doing. And that was the first time where I went, oh, I see, yeah, you actually can take that too far. And so I find it interesting in I now am able to admit in public, yeah, there are occasionally I'll go back and read something, or someone will send me a line, and I'll go, yeah, that wasn't bad, was it? Well,
I know what you're talking about because I it's been funny to me to notice that I think humility is an attribute. Humility is an attribute. But have you seen some people that they're so humble, and you start to look and go, you seem awfully proud of being humble.
one of my favorite moments, I had a friend who was just a whiz bang lap steel player and did time in Nashville and everything, just smoking lap steel player, and a very thoughtful, reflective, gentle dude. And one day he and I we were in the studio, and he had just laid down some scorching track right off, like your friend that you mentioned in the opening. Never seen the music before, anything, just listened and played along. It just scorched it. And we get done and shut the mic off, and I looked at him. I said, "Man," I said, "You are so good at playing that thing." And he started. You could see him start to go, "Oh." And then he just looked up at me and smiled and goes, "Yeah, I can play the hind end off this thing."
It's funny to me, and I laugh every time I hear somebody reference Moses being humble because the Bible says he was humble. Okay, in Numbers there is a verse that said, "And there lived in this land a man who was the most humble man on the earth, and his name was Moses. And you know who wrote that? Moses. I'm like, really? Really? Ah, yeah. And there's a guy, and his name is Moses, and he's very humble. Yes, that is me. So every time I hear somebody talking about Moses being humble, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, as long as we're, I'll open myself up to criticism for this maybe. But one of my favorite subset of athletes are NFL backup quarterbacks, because I'm fascinated by someone who is up in the top nth percent of their profession, and yet is regarded, if they're regarded at all, because some of them you don't. I'm always amazed when some guy, the star quarterback will get hurt, and they'll bring in this backup, and it's some guy that you've never heard of, and it's like, yeah, it's his 12th year in the league.
Right.
You go, oh, well, he must be doing something right. He can play a little ball. And I love the idea of someone who has worked that hard, has that much talent, is that close to the top. Because in a way, they're working even harder, because they're not working for the hope of the reward that the guy right down the bench from is going to get. And what I'm leading to here is, I've always said, and again, I hope I'm not just telling the same stories every time I come on, but
No.
you mentioned your New York Times bestseller experience. Mine was very much the same. It was a one-off. It was great. I'm thrilled. It's on every one of my books now. But I always say I was like the amateur baseball player, played semi-pro, single A, double A, triple A. I got called up for one weekend series with the Brewers and the Yankees. They put me in the 7th inning. I rapped out a nice bloop single, and then a week later they sent me back to AAA. So I was there, and so I have been in situations where I've been asked to write something, and sometimes in a hurry, and I turn around a nice line, and someone goes, "Well, you're pretty good at this," and I just go, I've taken some batting practice over the years.
Yeah.
It's not an accident that I'm here. Yeah, try to keep a governor on that, but occasionally I think it's okay to because that's also a way of letting people know that you do take this seriously, and that you do have to work hard at this stuff. It's like whatever your craft.
Yeah. I think too. I include you in this with me. I hope you don't mind me including you in this with me, but I think that we are great encouragement to people who want to be writers, who, because I was the last person that anybody would think. I mean, I said for years that I was not the best writer in my senior English class.
Oh.
And then I met a lady who had sat in front of me in that senior English class, and she was a professor of literature at Ole Miss, and I realized I wasn't the best writer on my row, in my senior English class. And so I think there is there's a lot of hope for people who want to think and really get to it.
There's room for utility players.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, a utility player hits a home run, and it's beautiful. And then you go back to work, and that's kind of how I feel. I feel just lucky to be in there swinging. And so now, again, we're being really honest about our egos here. There's one other thing where, when you talk about all the time that you have put in as a writer and that I have put in as a writer, and again, big believers in humility. Here's my bottom line on humility is, we're all going to fall, and I would just prefer to fall from a small height. So in a way, my own, again, we're back to the idea of humility also being a little bit self-serving, but I just, it's like, look, I know what I'm dealing with, and I'm dealing with a hugely imperfect, bumbling, bald-headed dad at the end of the day, just trying to do the best he can. But when you do put in the time, and when there's a reason you can write a sentence, one thing that people will say to me, they'll go, well, you have a real flair for writing. And I just go, it's not really a flair. Flair is when you get lucky and you sink the half court shot, right? Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, it's all, I'm just, same as you, just lucky to be here.
And that utility player metaphor, I was a Braves fan growing up, and Phil Niekro was my favorite pitcher, Nuxie.
Yeah.
Phil Niekro. And Matt, look at, Google Phil Niekro's brother. Phil Niekro, do you remember, Mike, who Phil Niekro's brother was?
Joe.
I think it was Joe.
Joe.
Yeah, Joe Niekro. Joe Niekro was in the major leagues too. And so they are a pair of brothers that won 300 games.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Phil won 300 without Joe, but Joe was a pair of those brothers that won. And it's like when I'm with Jerry Jenkins, who's a friend of mine. He wrote the Left Behind series, and he's written 200 books. And I'll tell people, one of my greatest professional accomplishments is that together, Jerry and I have sold 100 million books. Yeah, Jerry sold 99 million of them.
My favorite stories similar to that is, I don't know if you're familiar with Rick, I don't ever know how to say his last name, Riordan or Riordan, but he's written this huge series of very successful children's books, and they're all based on Greek mythology. And
okay.
My kids loved them, the audiobooks and the books, and he's just one of these machines too, where it's just hit after hit after hit. And I remember one day my own dear daughter coming into I don't know what she had, but it had the New York Times bestseller list. And she comes into the kitchen, our humble little kitchen in our little farmhouse in Fall Creek, Wisconsin, and she points, she's like, Dad, Rick Riordan is #1 again. How come you can't do that? It's like, I'm in there swinging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Mike, I really enjoy talking to you. I guess, there's no end to this. I could, the last time you and I did a podcast, I told people, I said, yeah, we went off the air and talked for 45 more minutes. And so I'm just going to just consider you like a regular conversation, because people really enjoy you. And so occasionally I'm just going to call and say, hey, come on, let's talk. Because I really enjoy talking to you, and I'm a fan, and I'm a great admirer of what you do and the dad you are. And so I appreciate you being with us.
Well, I'm an imperfect person bumbling along, but I love these conversations too. So yeah, anytime you wanna call me, and if you even want to keep me on, task and talk about something more specific, I can do it. But and I will say that just now I don't have my reading glasses on, so I'm just kind of looking at the little green dot and hoping that I look like I'm making eye contact. But I did you maybe heard that ding. That was a text. I could see it was from my wife, but I don't know what it said. So,
well,
probably a good time to wrap it up.
Yeah. We'll wrap it up right now. You can put your reading glasses on and answer your wife. Thank you, Mike, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of another episode of The Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing the tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Limpert. The Noticer theme written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Direct steam injection pasteurization for the entire cast and crew by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional funding provided by the Council of Wisconsin Almond Herders. Friends, do you enjoy your almond milk without thought of the work necessary to produce such abundance? Does your family scarf down carton after carton of the sweetest almond milk available and never think about the laborious process of raising and maintaining an almond herd? A new documentary has been made available to raise awareness of this little-known approach to harnessing nature's bounty. You'll learn about the gathering of almond boys in the 1800s and how they managed to round up unclaimed stray almonds, branding the unruly nuts and creating fenced spaces, protecting them from early shelling by rustlers. You'll see footage from days of yore, the big almond drives across the prairie, and you'll become acquainted with the newest technology in today's modern equipment. No, the big ranches no longer milk their almonds by hand at the end of the day, a process that often lasted well into the night, draining every precious drops from those tiny nipples. Now, each nut is hooked to its own suction tube so that not an ounce of moisture is wasted. Please patronize your local theater when the documentary comes your way and spread the word. From the Council of Wisconsin Almond Herders, Nut Tits, the true story of squeezing big dreams out of nothing.